I'm going to talk about the Pythagorean Theorem, and I'm going to use the broad example of an if and only if statement, which essentially this is, from a logic standpoint, a biconditional statement, which means we could read the first clause and then the second clause, or we could read it as the second clause and then the first clause. It means that the converse holds if it's an if-then statement. We have a right triangle if and only if a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We could also state it as a squared plus b squared equals c squared if and only if we have a right triangle. So that's the first part, making the statement of the Pythagorean theorem. The next thing is, what do we do with a squared plus b squared equals c squared? This is one thing that students run into, trying to figure out which sides of the triangle should be A, B, and C, and this leads to mistakes happening if you don't have the sides in the right places. One specifically is the most important. C should be the hypotenuse. An alternative version of this might place H here where the C is, but then students could potentially mistake that for the height of the triangle. So I want to use the traditional a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which many people learn, and I want to explain it in a way that hopefully helps you remember how to put a and b in a good place to remind you that c should be the hypotenuse, being the last side that's left. So I want to work with a and b. A and b can commute. It doesn't matter which order they go in because you're adding two terms. If this is a real number squared and this is a real number squared, you will have the sum of real numbers giving you back a real number. I want to call this something and this something so that it relates to the triangle that will remind me that C should always be the hypotenuse. So the hypotenuse is always the side directly across from the 90-degree angle. Another word for height is altitude, and so I want to label the height of my triangle as altitude. And I want to label the base of my triangle as base. And I've already said this last side, the one that is opposite the 90-degree angle, is hypotenuse. So this is the labeling that I've put on my triangle. Now I want to relate it back to a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Notice that altitude starts with A and base starts with B. So I'm going to call this my A side. I'm going to call this my B side. And that leaves this last side to be C. Since I only have three variables here, if I fix A and B, C must be the remaining side. Even though you might not remember that C is always the hypotenuse, if you keep in mind that A should always be altitude and B should always be base, C will have to be the hypotenuse, even though C doesn't really remind you of hypotenuse, which starts with H. And now when you plug in numbers, if you're given numbers for these, you will hopefully get these numbers in the correct order. Now again, I said that A and B are reversible, so it is not actually critical that A and B be this specific side and this specific side. C is the one that's critical, but if you get A and B in these positions, then you'll have to put C as the hypotenuse. So hopefully this helps you with a technique for understanding where the numbers should plug into this formula so that as you work through problems, you will have your hypotenuse in the correct location.